I'm Deputy Chief Technology Officer for the City of New York. I focus on broadband. I really appreciate this topic. I appreciate being joined by Rahul, Brian, and Dabriah, who will speak a little bit about the work that they're doing. New York City is it's a challenging place to connect all New Yorkers. We're big, we're complicated, but we have a mayor who's very committed to that effort. Community-based networks, mesh networks, are something that is of great interest to us. The city has invested over $3 million in innovative mesh networks, including in East Harlem. And by the way, as far as we know, that's the largest commitment that any city has made to this type of approach. East Harlem is one of the sites for one of those networks, led by Silicon Harlem, in partnership with Union Settlement, Hope Community, and Youth Action, Youth Build. And in fact, if there are any small businesses that were impacted by Sandy that are in the East Harlem area, it's still possible to join in that project. And I'd invite you to talk to the folks at Silicon Harlem or Union Settlement about that. One of the things that we saw with Sandy and why our friends at the Economic Development Corporation, who ran this grant program, focused on this is because Sandy exposed a lot of inequities, including in which small businesses and which communities were able to stay connected and which weren't. Very interested in this approach to that, as well as to solving some other connectivity problems in New York and elsewhere, as you'll hear. One of the things that has come out of also that program is sort of an open source and a modular approach to portable networking kits, which now volunteers in New York are sending to Puerto Rico with people from the Puerto Rican diaspora that they've trained, so that communities there can be connected through the type of approach that you're going to hear a little bit about today. It's just like in Puerto Rico. There's a lot of different efforts to bring connectivity back to that island, along with all the other needed infrastructure that our neighbors and friends there need. But one of the things I think that's notable about that approach is you've got a kind of the Google balloon. I don't know if anybody's seen that story where they're floating a balloon with connectivity over the island, and by doing that they can get connectivity to a large area very quickly. And that approach is really innovative and profound. But at some point that balloon kind of, when it floats away, all that connectivity floats away with it. But this type of community-controlled asset stays with a community and becomes part of the community's own wealth and assets. So I'm very excited to learn from these three folks who have taken this approach in different situations, and I'm going to ask them just to start by introducing themselves and just very briefly describing their project before we get into the overall topic of the conversation. So, Dabriah, would you like to start?
Hi, my name is Dabriah. My nickname is Day. I am the project manager for Red Hook Wi-Fi, down in Red Hook, way far down in Red Hook. We have an existing mesh network that we started in about 2011. So we have about 15 nodes. Sometimes they're all up. A lot of the times they're not. It's a struggle, but we will be expanding the network to about 40 more businesses in the community in a few months, and we're really excited about covering the neighborhood with this connectivity, but also about providing local jobs.
Hi, I'm Brian Hall. I'm an organizer with NYC Mesh, which is a community-owned network. We use Wi-Fi and Ethernet to connect people to broadband. We have one large antenna downtown, which is connected connected to fiber. So we have our own gateway now, which is great. And Most of our nodes are in Chinatown, Lower East Side, and East Village, and we have some in Brooklyn and a couple in Queens. So we have about 80 nodes at the moment.
My name is Rahul Joshi. I'm with Microsoft. I work in the data center division, where we're stringing a network between all of our 40 data centers around the world. I kind of do a little bit of both of what my other esteemed colleagues do. One is to provide network to communities where we set up those data centers, affordable broadband. And the second is to combine it with programs that actually lift the community. Because as you know, if we just provide connectivity, it doesn't deliver enough actual value when it comes to really doing anything meaningful to that site. I'm responsible for affordable access for Microsoft around our community, around our data centers. I have 8 data centers that I'm lighting up this year, data center communities, and we'll be moving on to others next year. I'm happy to be here to learn more than actually have anything to really contribute to, because I think you've done a lot more of this than I have, and I think that with your knowledge, I'll be able to contribute more effectively to the centers that I'll be supporting.
Excellent.
So just to start, the title of this panel is Let's Mesh Together. And I don't know if that's something that people in this audience have experience with. So I was just going to ask, how do you explain what mesh networks are? And I guess you can answer from either a technical perspective or a lay perspective, since I'm sure you have to talk to both types of audiences in your work. And I guess we can go back the same direction, Dabriah, if you want to. Or we can come back the other way.
No, it's
Okay.
fine. This tech, just the tech field in general is completely new to me. I am a marketer, a public speaker. I am someone that can get out and sell something. So that's why I was hired, because in order to get this network off the ground, I had to sell this idea to businesses that were very, very resistant. But when I think of mesh, I think of a web, right? So usually we have just this point of connection, and then it goes in one direction or another. But with mesh, it goes out, but then you can also connect the nodes to each other. So it makes this very resilient connection that you don't really have with the common point of connection and, in terms of point of connection and delivery. So I really see it as like this web that communities can use to connect. Even when the power is down, they can still use it to connect with one another. So it really is just like this web of connection for me. That's how I think of it.
And Brian, I know that mesh is just one of the sort of technical, one of the ways you build out your network.
Most of the nodes are running mesh software. The advantage of mesh is that you can have multiple connections to the internet. We call them gateways. So, and we have our own gateway connected to the backbone network, and we can connect to like a Link NYC kiosk. That can be a gateway, or your Time Warner Spectrum connection to home. That can be another gateway. And the reason that ISPs wouldn't use a mesh network is because it's very hard to figure out who to pay when you don't even know where you're getting your internet from. But for us, it's great because it's resilient, and if one internet connection goes down, it just automatically uses another one.
Rahul, do you want?
We use mesh networks for resiliency and portability within our data centers and within our facilities. We don't use them for, of course, we just don't have the bandwidth to transmit data between data centers. But we use them internally, and that's the technology that we want to bring into the communities.
So what is it about mesh networks that you think are really suitable to the idea of community ownership? Now, Rahul, do you want to start with that?
To me, I'll go a little bit off of what Brian was talking about. I think Brian said it's really difficult to set up a billing system with one of these kind of meshed services. So you almost kind of need community involvement, or maybe the involvement of the utility. That's who I find myself working with, at least in 2 communities that I'm in right now, where you have publicly available fiber network. And then you can use those as starting points for building several different access points within the community to deliver on the promise. So you kind of need a community, you kind of need somebody to deliver that fiber, and somebody to do the care and feeding of that system, because it's not going to look after itself. So somewhere along the line, we're looking, and Microsoft is not interested in becoming an ISP, and we're not interested in becoming a carrier at all, but we are interested in supporting local, and it's always best if it's local organizations that are willing to, either cooperatives or otherwise, who are willing to care and maintain those, the hardware and the service for the community that's using it. And the core there being that it's affordable.
And Dabriah, maybe you could talk about how you adapt the network to the specifics of the Red Hook community.
So I think anytime you take a service into a location, right, into a community, you have to take into account what the community actually needs. And this is something that's important to me because I grew up in Red Hook, in the public housing, not on the outskirts, and what I've noticed is that when you live in poverty, people always think they know what's best for you. So they'll come in with their services and they say, here, aren't you happy? No, this is not what I need. So what we do with our Wi-Fi network is we make sure that we go out and we talk to people about what it is that they want to see. You know, what do they want to use this network for? And one of the big things that came up for us was jobs, employment. You know, you can't just walk into a place and apply for a job now, right? You need the internet. You absolutely need the internet. The internet is actually, you know, you have to send your resumes and cover letters through the internet so that, you know, they can go through scanning software to pick out keywords so you can even get an interview. So these are things you need, right? So when we hear that, then it's like, okay, how can we tailor our network to what these people need? So one of the focuses that we're really excited about is creating like a, you know, you hear of the school to prison pipeline. We want to create a school to local jobs pipeline. All right, so it's kind of like you come into this program that we have, you know, you use our network, you adopt these services, but it's really to get you to the point where you want to be, you know, where it's something important to you. So, yeah.
And could you talk a little bit more about the Digital Stewards Program and how the young people participate in the building of the network?
Sure, so I absolutely love the Digital Stewards. We have a group of young adults who can come into this program and essentially learn technology. So they call themselves technologists as well. Right, so they have a program where they might learn graphic design, they might learn video production, or they would learn how to work on the network. So the existing network was actually built by a group of young adults from Red Hook, right? And most of them from public housing, which is amazing. So you're creating jobs, you're creating a pathway to careers for people who don't normally have those opportunities. And another thing I love is we actually just hired one of our former digital stewards to maintain our current network because we were having some issues. So to be able to call this young man who has interned for Google and is now in school and is looking for ways to make money, to be able to hire him, another young man from, you know, public housing, is just a blessing.
And, Brian, you also rely on the people who are using the network to build the network. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we have very little funding, so the way it works is you buy your own router and we'll help you put it on the roof. So it costs about $160 to get an antenna on your roof. This is we got a grant of $30,000 for this year, which is paid for our big sector antenna. Nice. And the installs on all the buildings, we rely on the people in the buildings to install. Eventually, we'd like to get into poorly served areas, and we're hoping to get donations so we can wire up people that way.
So how does somebody become one of those people that wants to put something on their roof?
We just go to our website and fill in a join form, and we'll get back to you, and we'll try and get a connection to another rooftop or a connection to our big sector antenna.
And what does it take, Rahul, maybe you can start with this, to, you were talking about the local aspect, to what's in the care and feeding.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
That looks like us either putting money into that community to help a startup, or giving vouchers to local folks that can't afford it. We're working on both those programs right now. But, I mean, implementations right now, depending on the community.
But in terms of like the network, how do you gotta, you were talking about the young person who needs to help maintain, some of the networking. So yeah, what goes into just sort of keeping these things running?
Yeah. From our standpoint, all I know is how we manage our own mesh network, which is basically you have a 3-year life cycle on all equipment. And so after that 3 years, we're recycling that. And that recycling usually has 2 kind of outputs. I'm working on internally right now is actually trying to figure out how to just give that away. Right now, we're not doing that. Because of liability issues and licensing and maintenance issues. And it's a real complex set of accounting, like fixed asset accounting and managing the depreciation and all this business, really. So it's a complex process to do that. But for us, we are turning over hardware every 3 years. And the other thing that we do have, the other thing that we are working with right now, actually I've got a meeting system next week, is how can we actually combine our philanthropic efforts with theirs so that we can give hardware. For us, it's got to giving away in kind. And if they're capital heavy expenses, they cost a lot of money. But it's a lot easier than just handing over a check and having somebody else look after it. And so from my standpoint, first is find ways to give hardware in locations that need it. The second is help local organizations, either ISPs or independent organizations like yours that support the community, to train them to look after it and give them a runway of about 1 year or 2 years. And then after that, build in enough profit margin so that at the end of that period you have an annual recurring revenue sufficient to support the service itself.
And we should be clear, what are some of the geographic locations that you're doing
Well,
this in?
my program for this year is mostly rural, except for 2 locations. One is Dublin, the other is Amsterdam, so they're outside the States. But I've got Boynton, Virginia, Cheyenne, Wyoming, Des Moines, Iowa, Quincy, Washington, which is smaller than Boynton, okay? And then Chicago and San Antonio. Those are the ones for this year that I want to, well, probably 8 months left to nail those. But as you can see, all our data centers in pretty rural communities. And the interesting thing I find here is because you have such social capital in this community where people are coming up with, oh, you should do this, you should do that, and rising up to help. I do not see that in Boynton. In Mecklenburg County in Virginia, I do not see that. And so it's really refreshing to see it, and to maybe just use some of your experience to help light up ideas out there is probably the way that I'm going to run it. But for each of those communities, they're rural, and there's only about 8 of them. There's another 40 and growing, okay, around the world. And so the idea for this year is really to pilot how to do it right, and then to try to stamp it for other locations next year.
And Brian, I'm guessing your challenge is not how you calculate capital depreciation, but you do have an approach to converting social capital into this ongoing maintenance. So what does it take to keep things up and running once you've got the equipment on the roof?
Over the years, with the Ubiquity equipment, it's really reliable nowadays. And, we have very few reboots. We had some problems with the mesh nodes, but I wrote a script to reboot that if it has a problem.
Nice.
So in the past 4 or 5 months, we had a really stable network. And, maintenance hasn't been a big problem at all.
And for us, it's the opposite. So for some reason, this last 4 or 5 months have been horrible. And I watched this network that was up and running consistently kind of just fall down around me. But what happens is, because we are a nonprofit organization with a focus on youth development, right, there is not a lot of our resources that are set aside for the maintenance of this network currently. So that's something that we're working on currently to make sure that, you know, when nodes go down, we can actually get someone out there to get them back up. So we are using Ubiquity as well, and because we hired that former digital steward, we should be fine. But anyone thinking of going into this type of endeavor, right, and doing this, really needs to have a commitment to making sure you see it done correctly, because it can be, you know, you need the manpower, you need the money, you just need somebody who really is like focused on it consistently. It's not something you can just kind of put up and leave. Like, you have to make sure it's good.
There is one disadvantage to mesh networks. If you get one badly behaved router, it speaks to every other
Yes.
router. So you've got to make sure. I run a script every minute, and if it's not behaving, it resets everything.
I guess that's the other way. I guess it can be sort of like a community that way, for better and for worse.
Right.
It's like one person gets sick and then comes and coughs and spreads it to another, right?
Yeah, exactly. It can be like that. Just want to see if at this point people in the audience have any questions or points you want to raise. Sure, in the back here.
Yeah, this is just there's an interesting fellow, I'm sure maybe some of you know about, Paul Guerin, who had the Wi-Fi NY group.
Yeah.
And then some of his interesting exploits he noticed in trying to create this accessibility, which it's like mesh networks are trying to help democratize access. But the internet itself is kind of strangely monopolized. So especially the publishing. And he has a whole nother issue where he started creating a top-level domain name provider, because it just makes no sense that, you know, we should pay only like $1 per domain. It's all just rent-seeking behavior that's just screwing everybody. So he started doing that, and then he got attacked by ICANN saying you're not allowed to publish this on the internet. And so it's very interesting to look at his work that in New York City, there seems to be this potential for mesh networks to not just connect to the internet itself, but to provide localized internets that can kind of be a nice, trusted neighborhood, just like a newspaper, something that people just work in and off. And I'm curious about those potential possibilities and for disaster response and things like that. Thinking about harnessing that potential. What do you guys think about that?
Thank you so much. One of the things that happened for me after Hurricane Sandy, and I had the displeasure of being in Red Hook during that time, and I remember that night, you know, being so in awe that the water was coming up, and we went outside. What's happening? And it was a joke at first. You know, oh my, wait a minute. There's water coming from there, and there's water coming from there. Wait a minute. There's water coming from there. There's nowhere to go, because we are surrounded by water on 3 sides. So the water's coming up. We go back in the building, and the lights flicker. And by the time we get upstairs, the lights are gone, and they stay off for 14 days. 14 days. And it was just a really harrowing experience. But what I learned in that moment was the power of community, right? And because of the internet and the media, I think we sometimes get so focused on what's going on miles and miles away. But what I love about mesh, you know, these mesh networks, these community networks, is that it really brings it home. So sometimes instead of focusing on what's going on across the water, it's like, wait a minute, what can I do right here? So you know, in terms of resilience, we have these networks that, like my colleague was saying, when one node goes down, you know, it'll just kind of reroute the connection to another one. So that's resilient in itself. But we're also going to make sure that about like our gateways, so that's about 11 of our sites are going to have a solar powered backup system, so that just in case we lose power like we did before for 14 days, we'll have this reserve of energy to keep the network going. And our solar partner is here. David, are you here? Okay, he just stepped out. I was about to give him some love because he's working really hard to make sure those backup systems are up and running. But that's a really exciting, you know, prospect. And even if we lose connection to the internet, our network will still be able to connect with each other through the server, which is really excellent. So we're excited about those things. So it's like it brings it home, you know, like, okay, what can we do in case there's an emergency right here? You know, what can I do? And Mesh is helping with that.
Thanks, David.
Jolie?
Well, just in response, at the Radical Networks conference in Brooklyn last week, a guy gave a talk. I have to look up his name here. It was Drew Mayrotra, and he's built a thing like you're talking about in Bed-Stuy. It's called OtherNet, and you can find it at othernet.xyz. And I have a question, and the question was, Brian, who paid for your suit 30 grand? Where's your 30 grand from?
It came from ISOC.
What is, you have to say a little bit more about ISOC is. No acronyms without
Oh,
explanation.
yeah, the Internet Society. And Jolie is the president of the New York branch of the Internet Society.
Actually, maybe you can say more about how one goes about, getting, that funding or other sources of support for projects like this. If you're not a community with Microsoft Data Center, which...
Yeah, this was our first grant application, and we're wondering what our next grant will be for next year. We still have to get it.
I'll just speak further, just briefly about that. Is that as the Internet Society, what we're faced with a situation where 50% of the planet is connected and 50% isn't. And what we're feeling is that as far as the sort of central infrastructure reaching out to people, it's kind of reached its limit, and now that it's down to community networks hooking themselves up and reaching back out, hooking themselves up into the internet. And recently our CEO made a speech in Shanghai at the Mobile World Congress saying that, the cell carriers of the world had to open their pipes to community networks, and if they didn't do it voluntarily, that policy should be made to, like, say, if you have connectivity in areas, you've got to, like, make it generally available if you're open. And also, just recently a paper on spectrum, on opening up spectrum for community networks, another issue. And a matter of concern this week is that the FTC is talking about taking the citizen broadband radio service and giving some of it back to, like, 5G rather than keeping it open for, like, everybody else. That's something that attention should be paid to that. And I'm very interested in Microsoft's work on white spaces.
Dabriah, can you talk a little bit about resources or like funding, grants, or
Can I? Well, I'm really happy. Before I got there, we actually won this RISE Award from the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Thanks, Kokai. And, that has really provided the money to create a very robust network, and then to add the resilient component, because this stuff is not cheap. And one of the things we are doing is thinking forward. It's like, how are we going to pay the licensing fees? Because with certain equipment you have to license, and down the road when we're out of money, we have to find a way to keep this network up and running for our community. And that's another thing about bringing things hyper local, right? I want to get to the point where we don't have to necessarily depend on outside entities to fund us, to keep us up and running. Why can't we find a way to do that right in our own community? That same community that came together in the days after Sandy and made everything happen, basically for themselves, because we didn't have anyone to rescue us. So we can do the same thing, but it takes a lot of work and commitment.
And I just want to second your shout out to Kokai Otosi and the whole team at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. The RISE program that Dabriah is referring to is, I see it as a heroic example of essentially civic hacking, because the way that disaster recovery funding tends to work is, it comes with lots and lots and lots of strings attached to kind of replace what was destroyed. And through the incredible ingenuity of the people at the Economic Development Corporation, they took a portion of the city's recovery fund from Sandy and turned it into this innovation challenge where people had a totally different approach to connectivity, to energy, to building materials, could apply to this competition and basically start a whole new industry and approach using the award funding. So, again, that is really, I mean, Red Hook Initiative had already had this process going, but it's helped sort of take that approach to another level. And again, partners like Silicon Harlem, Fifth Avenue Committee, Kingsway Y, are really adapting this approach to their communities that were hard hit by Sandy to think about, how we do this differently to stay connected. So, Kokai, thank you for all the work that you and your colleagues have done with that. Yeah.
The power washed out in Sandy downtown last time. When the water recedes and power still washed out. Has the city thought about any way to do mobile trucks or something that could pull into an area and say, okay, this area got somehow knocked out, right? And rather than let that group, since we're driving everyone to the internet, all 311, everyone's driven to something electric. Is there something, have you thought about, or maybe you already have this in place, in the event that we don't have electricity, or we don't have the internet in an area, that you guys have ready on the shelf something you can take and put on a generator truck there for something, or even analog stuff to say, all right, we're going to run around to every bus stop and put up a sign that says your nearest Wi-Fi is here, and if somebody filled them with a marker and says, okay, so there's Wi-Fi 12 blocks away, at least it'd be a notice, as opposed to just going, where is it? I don't know.
Yeah.
Is there something you could do old school even, or some emergency school that would be ready for areas?
Yeah, well, the first thing I think, is to unpack the who the you is in that question, because we rely, well, generally we rely on private companies to connect us, and so I think that in some ways that's a question for what readiness do those companies have to keep us connected in a situation like that. I think one of the things we found in Sandy is not much. I think certainly if you're in a place like Puerto Rico, the answer is almost none. And so I think there's been some learning in Sandy, and I think you did see that in, like Houston and a couple other places. In New York, one of the things we've done is, develop some policies and recommendations to try and increase those resilience standards and those recovery plans from those companies. Whether that's sufficient, hopefully we don't have to find out. But then, as I said, I think we were also marveling at the kind of portable network kit approach that has come out of some of these RISE projects, which does sort of exactly that. And it in a backpack can create a local connectivity, and then if there's internet connectivity, it can spread that around, and you can add repeaters. And that sort of portable network kit is what it's called. That approach, I think, is like you're saying, except that is that you in that question or in that answer, the you is it's a community generated response. And so I think again really learned a lot from that Red Hook response, just that neighbor to neighbor connectivity. I don't know if you want to talk about.
I do. I actually was doing some research this hurricane season because what I'm seeing is very alarming. These storms that are coming through, they're getting more powerful, and we need to be prepared. Like, we really need to take that into consideration. And one of the countries, an island that does a great job of embedding disaster preparation into their everyday life is Cuba. So do some research on that. They are really this is something that their children learn in schools, that they are very prepared for on a regular basis. So, it's helpful or I think we have this way of looking to our government to provide these things, but we're in our own communities. Why can't we say, you know what, damn it, we're going to be prepared the next time a storm comes? Let's take notes from places like Cuba, who have figured out how to incorporate disaster preparation into every facet of their lives, so that when internet goes down, we don't need notices. People have already been trained, and they already know where to go to get certain things. So to me, it's like bringing it back down to a very, local way of connecting and saying to each other, what can we do to make sure we prepare? We can't wait on Time Warner to prepare. We can't wait on, these different systems to support us. We can kind of create these things right here where we are.
Some of our schools are very big, like PS 156. These schools have a lot of, so some of those are sort of designated shelters as well. But as you know, if you parked yourself outside of Dunkin' Donuts, you can pick up a Wi-Fi from a lot of places. Maybe the mayor's office, Department of Education, could say part of the resiliency of those schools, the shelters is going to be, they're also going to serve as like internet hubs. Put generators there or something, so at least they'll have electricity. And then if we have a portable thing, we have a portable one, so that'd be everywhere. It would be the same places where people are staying, and then at least if you get nearby, you can get.
So I just wanted to ask you all, we're running a little bit short on time. When you think about the first step, if you're approaching the first person, which you all are further down the road, but if somebody wanted to know, I'm going to go talk to somebody about starting this thing from the very beginning, what's the first thing that you might say to the first piece of advice or the way that you approach that first person?
I'm probably not the best
You just
guy.
say, I'm from Microsoft.
Yeah, there you go.
Let me just cut a PO.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of setting up a...
But I think that in some of those rural communities, right, you face those questions of what is it that you're trying to do. So I don't want to minimize the challenge.
Yeah.
And in some ways, maybe being from Microsoft makes people wonder, as you were saying.
Right.
You're not from.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point. I think the first thing that we are working towards and that we're learning more about is how to consult the community first. So you consult the community about what the demands are, the kind of throughput requirements, where broadband will be consumed. We look for certain indicators of social need. Only some of those you can actually get through current data systems, but we actually go out into the communities and talk to the local providers. I was just talking with the sheriff in Boynton last week, just to understand what goes on with the rhythm of the community, how they operate. So you look at what we're trying to do anyway, is looking to match social need, socioeconomic needs with the right kind of technology. It's not always mesh. Okay? It's not always TV white spaces, as we heard either. In some communities, we have fiber at every door. We just have an awareness problem, and we have an affordability problem. So I think every community is going to come at it a little bit differently. But the first is to find that agency inside the community to help direct us in terms of where we can establish the right kind of broadband.
Right. So you sort of. First thing you do is you begin by listening.
Yeah.
Maybe it's the first step.
Yeah, it's the only way to do it. I think I believe maybe it was Dave saying that in many cases, what you find is an organization, parachuting into a community is trying to do good or do them some good or something like that. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't matter where you do it, anywhere around the world. Whether it's a rural community somewhere in India or in the middle of a vibrant city. To think that you almost automatically know jumping in what that community needs is a mistake. And so the first starts with listening to that.
Brian, do you want to share your experience?
When I first joined the mesh network, I did a lot of research into community mesh networks, especially in this country, and it was quite depressing. They'd all failed. There was just dead websites everywhere, and I was about to give up, and then I started looking overseas, and I found this network in Spain, Wi-Fi, and it's the biggest community network. And the person that started, Ramon Rocco, is just figured out everything you have to do to start a community network. And now we're getting more high profile. I get emails from overseas often asking, how do I start one in my country? So I did a blog post about this. If you go to our website /y, it tells you all the steps you need to do this, and it's very difficult to organize. And the first step on my blog post is to research. You go to Wi-Fi's website and figure out how they did it, and there's other ones. It's Freifolk in Germany, and there's a few big ones across the world. And don't try and start start from zero. Just copy what people have done successfully in other places. Use open source software and read the rest of my blog post for the details.
I did read his blog post. It was really good. I read as much as I can. I think for me, because I was someone who was out promoting this, because I had to get businesses to sign up in order for us to even move forward, right? And in order to do so, one of the things that we have that's a common bond in Red Hook, regardless of whether you're in public housing, you're not in public housing, you're employed, you're unemployed, is that the people who were there during Sandy suffered. So I used that because I knew they would be able to understand the suffering that, I had. And I would go in and I would say, hey, we have this Wi-Fi network, but it's for businesses that survived Sandy. We want to get this community connected, and in the, event that we might have another power outage, we would be able to still connect with each other and communicate and just have that that flow of information. And that's the thing that really got people like, yeah, you know what, we need this. So for me, it was just going in and using our common experience to sell this, that, hey, we need this, and a lot of people say yes, and a lot of people are like, well, I don't need it. But, it was just like this call to action. People wanted to help the community, and this mesh network will help the community.
I don't know if anybody can help me with this, but we're at time for our session, but is everything running late, or are we ending on the time of our session?
Well, I know we started a
We
little.
have like about 5 minutes left.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. Any other questions from the audience? Sean?
Could we get a sample pitch that you would make to the local business as to what it is, how it works, who pays for it, how it benefits them? Even an elevator pitch. No.
I was so happy when I finished recruiting my businesses that you just asking me that just took me back. Took me back to a place I don't want to go. But yeah, it was what I just told you. It was just, that was the opening line was really that, that common experience. It was bringing up Sandy, and I noticed that's what people could understand, especially if they were there at that time. And then all of the other stuff came after. So it was just like, am I going to have to pay for this? No, we have a grant, so you're fine. But we have to get on your roof and, put some equipment up there. Oh, is my landlord going to have to? No, it's free. But it really was just that common, connection and experience that did it for me, that I noticed worked.
And who's providing the internet
service
itself?
So we actually partnered with another local company, which is great, an ISP called Brooklyn Fiber, and they were actually our provider during Sandy, and their connection stayed up during Sandy. So Time Warner was out. I think we had Verizon at the time, that was down, but this ISP stayed up. So to be able to go to people and say, and we're using local ISP, Brooklyn Fiber, that didn't fail during Sandy. These were like selling points, right? But the selling points I'm talking about are all very personal to that community. So you find what's personal to your community and use that to sell.
And the grant money pays for the ongoing internet service?
Yes, for a certain amount of time, and then after that, we gotta figure out what to do as a community.
What I find so, impactful about that example is you're turning a social relationship into a digital or like physical piece of infrastructure, a physical connection, and it really is mapping those connections to the community as opposed to what the way an engineer drew lines on a map, looking at Red Hook from a real distance.
Yes.
And that to me I think is one of the challenges for even for the city. And trying to think about what this looks like at some scale is, what parts of a city network are community-based, are defined by the community, and how do you do that across as many different communities and as much space as you have in New York City? If anybody has thoughts or answers on that.
Josh, I also just get the signal to wrap up in the next minute or two.
Okay.
So what we're looking for is just tall buildings in each neighborhood. And if we can get a tall building,
Yes.
we can jump from one building to the next, and that's what holds us back. So we dream of getting roof access to nicer buildings.
Yes. We do.
That's our dream. So it solves two problems at once. We can supply broadband to people that need it, and we get to hop to the next neighborhood.
Yeah, distribution within a NYCHA building can also be a challenge, but I do hear you. And if anybody else have any other thoughts, or maybe we'll just get last thoughts from our panelists.
This was great. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Everyone to the auditorium. We're about to do the big thing in the auditorium.
Big thing.